My name is Jason Bock. I'm a staff software engineer at Rocket Mortgage, and my fast focus talk is called Caching Options in .NET. If you want to check out, here's some places you can go to find out some information about myself. I do have a YouTube channel. You don't have to like it, but please subscribe. I would appreciate that. The code that I'm going to show, I do have one demo. If you want to take a look at it, you can go get it at that location, at that repository, and that link will be on the next slide as well. And all of the slides are on VS site, so you can get that information that way as well. So basically, you're just going to spend a little bit of time on what's the goal of caching, why do we want to do caching, what's the point of it, and then I'll go through a demo showing you a couple options, but really what I'm going to, the catch is there's really only one option in my opinion if you're going to do caching in .NET. There may be lots of things that you can do that can implement caching, but there's really one way from an API standpoint that you want to handle it in your code. Okay, so we'll cover that when I get to the demo. All right, so what's the goal of caching? And I would say probably one of the biggest goals of caching is to make your applications faster so that I'm not retrieving what is arguably probably very static data or data that doesn't change that much, that's accessed by most of the users of an application. If I can put that in memory or that's closer to the user so that I don't have to keep refreshing or getting that data from the database over and over again, that's a win. Okay. Now, like everything in life, there's trade-offs. If I do cache data, then I have to keep in mind that I'm probably putting stuff in memory somewhere, and that memory is now being allocated, and I'm not releasing it. So if I'm not careful, then I could potentially end up having a memory leak, right? And there's a phrase that you might have heard that says there's like essentially 3 problems in software development, which is naming things, cache invalidation, and off by 1 errors. So that, that's kind of, that's a problem with caching too. And that's why, as I go through the demo, I'm going to show you some stuff that makes that a issue that you really don't have to deal with. You can let this library handle it for you, okay? But this is typically why we do caching. And this slide, it might be a little bit hard to read all of the data on it. Again, you can get the slides if you want. But I really like this picture because it does show like what the difference is between what is in my L1 cache, and again, we're getting right down to the processor at that point, but comparing that all the way to if I'm going from a packet send from, I think it's California to the Netherlands and back, and it just shows you what the difference is with the same amount of data, how much faster it can be if I get it closer to the user. That's why we're essentially doing it. How do we do it? What are some things that we can do to cache that data? So I'm going to go into some code here and show you a couple of options. And some of these may be familiar to you. One of them is a relatively new way that's been provided by Microsoft, and that's what I'm going to kind of try to steer you towards from this point on. So in my app, again, trying to keep this simple, I decided that what I want to cache is the list of states in the United States, because that's pretty static. That doesn't change very often. So one of the ways, let me actually just run this first. Okay, and it's just a simple console app. So once it gets up and running, you're going to start to see some things going by in the console app. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail. But as you can see here, it's pausing for 7 seconds for some reason. And I'm picking Minnesota as the state that I'm always looking up in the list of states because that's where I live. I live in Minnesota. Okay, so if you go back through this, you can see that I'm saying I'm getting the states, I retrieve them. If you look at the timestamps here, you can see that there was basically a second delay in between those. I get the states again, another 2 seconds. Now, if I'm doing something with caching, it doesn't take that long at all. Now I'm throwing in this thing called iMemory cache, which the first time is still a second, but then after that, there's hardly any time to retrieve the state of Minnesota. Then I wait 7 seconds, and now I'm getting some messages in here when I'm doing some more retrieving, and then this thing called hybrid cache kicks in, and I do a couple of retrieves where the second time it doesn't take much time at all. So what is the code actually doing underneath the scenes with what you're seeing in the console window here? So come back here. One of the first things I do, which I don't use right away, but I'm going to use it later on, is this memory cache entry options. Okay, So as I said before, one of the problems that you might have if you do caching and you don't have a good strategy around your caching is you could throw in too much into, if you're using like a list or a dictionary, and then it just sticks around forever. And that's some memory that doesn't get freed up if people actually aren't using it. So what you can do with some of these libraries that I'm going to show you in a moment is you can do some configuration options, and how you configure what you're caching and when things should be released from the cache is up to you. It all depends on the problem that you're trying to solve and what your application does. But as you can see here, when I'm going to use these options, I'm going to have a time span of 5 seconds from now. Okay, and it's an absolute expiration. This means that no matter how many times I get something from a cache, that it will expire in 5 seconds. There's also things that you can do that, if I say here, and let's zoom in on that so you can see those a little bit clearer. You can see that you can actually have sliding expirations as well. So what this does is it says, maybe I have a sliding expiration of 5 seconds, but if somebody retrieves that or wants that in 2 seconds, then it slides for another 5. Okay, so it's basically saying if somebody accesses it, the timer gets reset. But once it gets past that window, then it will be evicted, and the next time you have to go back and retrieve it. Okay, so there are a couple things that you can do here. You can set priority. You can also set size, so that you can also do some eviction policies based on the size of the data that you're putting into your cache. Okay, so that's just the options. I haven't seen yet what we're actually putting this in to actually use this. Okay, now, as I said before, we may just use a simple list to do caching. And that's the first example I have here, though what I'm also doing at the beginning is I'm creating a service collection. If you're creating like an application builder for a web app or something like that, you already have a service collection that you can configure with your dependencies to register them. I don't have that in this simple console app, so I'm just creating the service collection directly. And as you can see here, I'm calling some methods, memory cache and hybrid cache and distributed memory cache. Okay, so the memory cache has been around in .NET for quite a long time. And that's actually what is, that's what I have the options set for that memory cache. You'll see that in just a moment. As you can see by the name, it's literally a memory cache. It's stuff that's stored in memory in your application. Okay? So it's not distributed. It has no knowledge of, if you're using something like Redis or some other distributed cache provider, it doesn't interact with that. Okay, but at least it gives you stuff that you can put in memory, and then it can also handle those eviction policies for you. What is new in .NET 9 and beyond is something called a hybrid cache. And if I go to my project file, you'll see the references I have to these packages, hybrid and memory. Okay, so if you want to use one or the other, I would recommend hybrid because it actually gives you more functionality. I'll explain that in just a moment. But all you have to do is just reference these from NuGet. With the hybrid cache, it can, even though my app is actually not, I'm not talking to Redis in my app, I don't have a distributed cache. When I say add distributed memory cache here, what that does is it just says, well, if you really don't have a distributed cache to configure, then what the hybrid cache will do is act like a memory cache. If you do want a distributed cache in your application, you can do that configuration in your app at startup, and then the hybrid cache will use that. So for you as a developer, there's no difference between the two. It's not like if I want to just do memory, I have to use memory cache. If I want to use a distributed cache, I have to use another API. The hybrid cache by its name brings those two together and makes it seamless for you to say, it's either going to be memory or it's going to be handled by a distributed cache provider, okay? So with these registrations, I create a provider, and these are the things you probably inject into your minimal APIs or your controllers or whatever your app does to get a reference to something like a cache so I can put data into it. So I'm going to have two versions of this, the memory cache and the hybrid cache. And then I'm going to have a stopwatch just to make it simple to see what happens at what time. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is get my list of states, and if I can get my mouse to show up, there we go. and I go to the definition of that method. It's pretty simple. You can see though that here's that synthesized delay. Like this is the work that a database or a data store or something else might have to do. I just made it tied to 1 second. And then I return a list of all the states. Okay. So that's why you're seeing that 1 second delay in the console window. Go back to my code here. You go back up to when I'm calling this. So the first time I get it, you'll notice that it takes, as you would expect, 1 second. If I say getting the states again, like I do here, this is why you'd want to do a cache, because every time I'm doing this, it's taking an amount of work. So to avoid that, I'm going to put it in the cache. Now, the APIs between the traditional memory cache and the hybrid cache are very, very similar. Okay. With a memory cache, what you'll typically do is say, get or create async. And so what this does is it says, based on a key, that's just a string value, some key to uniquely identify the set of data that I'm caching, I want to get the list of states. But if it's not in the cache, what I want you to do is call that method. Okay. And if it is in the cache, I just return that back. And I can also specify those options that I mentioned before to say based on the sliding expiration or the size or whatnot, to evict them at a certain point in time. Okay. So the first time I call this, as you saw in the console window, it's still going to take a second because it still has to get that data into it. And as you can imagine, if you're building an app, you may want to do some tricks to warm it up, to potentially in like your program CS file or your startup to maybe do some of these queries and get the data into the cache right away so the user never even sees those little bits of delay as you're retrieving data from whatever data store you have. Okay. And as you can expect, when I do retrieval from the memory cache again, it doesn't take that much time. Now I'm going to wait 7 seconds. And remember, I have an options here to say expire it with an absolute expiration of 5 seconds. Okay. So if I go down to that code that you see here, I'm waiting. I go now back to the memory cache, and that's where you see this message that's in in the memory cache saying it's been evicted, which you may go, well, wait a minute, after 5 seconds, shouldn't it have been evicted at that point? Well, that's not the way the cache works. It says if it's going to leave it in the cache until somebody actually tries to look at it, and then it will say, yes, I have it, but the policy has said it's expired, so now I'll evict it, and then I'll get a new refreshed version of that data. Okay, and you can set that here in the memory cache options with this register post eviction callback. If you want to do logging, just to say, hey, I want to know when things have been evicted, just so I can maybe do some, like I didn't expect the cache to work the way it did, so I can get some logging information and figure out maybe I have my policies wrong or something like that. So that's why that message is showing up. But again, it doesn't show up at 5 seconds. It shows up the next time I want to get that data. Okay. Of course, like I mentioned, hybrid cache is the new way of doing things in .NET. And as you can see by the hybrid cache API, it's pretty much the same thing. You know, I'm getting the data that I was getting before, and I only get it if I don't have it before. It's a little different, but it's essentially basically the same kind of call. One thing that you don't see here, but another thing that's nice about hybrid cache is that it handles stampeding. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I have a API or something like that, an application that's hosted as middleware, and I have a bunch of users hitting it, and at some point maybe the cache gets invalidated or nothing's in the cache, and I have a decent amount of usage with my application, I can potentially have n number of people running that same query to get that data in the cache. The memory cache doesn't handle, I'm only going to have one person do this or one request at a time. The hybrid cache handles that. Okay, so if you had n number of requests to come in to say, I need to get this data, it doesn't exist. The hybrid cache will say, I'm going to basically block the other callers until one of them gets the data into the cache, and then all of them will see that cache data. Okay, so again, you don't see that with the call here, but that's a nice feature that hybrid cache has. And that's why I'd actually recommend, if you are using memory cache, go to the hybrid cache. Just, if anything, just purely because of this new feature. It eliminates that just by the way it works, okay? And even though you're not seeing it here, you can also do options and configuration with the hybrid cache for eviction policies if you'd like. Okay. So any questions on anything that you saw in the code here? Is anybody using the hybrid cache right now? Is anybody doing caching at all? Okay, good. Are you using memory cache? Okay, so hopefully what you get out of this talk, if you've not ever used caching, is to strongly consider using it. And again, based on your scenarios, that hopefully will make some things a little quicker. And if you're using the memory cache, I would highly recommend that you upgrade if you are on .NET 9 or above, although I think the library actually will work for like .NET 8. You look at the targets, the TFMs that it has, but it came out with .NET 9. So if you can, upgrade to that because it has some extra goodness in there, especially if you're using distributed caching or you want to use a distributed cache. You can just plug it into your application with your services, like your service collection, your ILC, and the hybrid cache will just pick it up and start using it, and you're none the wiser. That's pretty much all I have. If you do have any other questions, just feel free to come on up. Otherwise, I'm done. Thank you for coming.